Here's a two-part dilemma that I often run into. Number one, the board I'm getting ready to use is either warped or has unflat sides. And number two, it's too big to fit through my planer. I'm sure you've seen videos on YouTube and elsewhere of sleds similar to this one where you use a router to flatten a board. I have too, but to be honest, I've been very intimidated in the whole concept. But I finally decided to bite the bullet and build one, and this is a video of my experience. I'm going to start off and show you some of the mistakes I made so that as you watch me build this, you won't duplicate the same mistakes. As you can see, the router should fit snugly, but not too snug so that it can travel easily along the sled. And you would think that the opening for the bit would be in the center of the sled. But because there is a flat on one side of the router base, this offsets the center of the hole when you put it in the carriage. This gives you just enough interference when using the large diameter router bits for the flattening process. My fix to this was simply to plunge the router through the opening I had made and trim off the excess on both edges. You can see the amount that I had to cut off. The other issue is with the guide stops on either end of the sled. These are used to keep the sled on the rails, and if they protrude too far down, you won't be able to get close enough to the work and thus have to extend the bit in the collet further than you should. So let's get right down to what we're building. The dimensions of the sled are 6 1/8 inch internal dimension. I'm using 3/4 inch plywood. The sides are 2 inches high and the length is 26 inches. The slot in the middle I cut at 2 inches. For the slot, I laid it out on the center of the board, took a 3/4 inch Forstner bit, cleaned out the four corners and then connected them with the skill saw. To compensate for the flat that's on the router base, I would add at least 3/8 to a 1/2 inch to the width of your slot. Assembly was done with glue and pocket screws. My initial rails were made out of 2x4s and assembled again with glue and pocket screws. I did the actual flattening on a piece of 3/4 inch melamine. I did this for a couple of reasons. Number one, it gave me something other than my workbench to attach the piece to, and number two, it gave me yet another assurance that I had a nice flat surface to work on. I didn't buy a specialty bit for this process to start out with. What I ended up with was a Freud double fluted straight bit, 1 3/4 inch diameter. Now that it's all waxed up, let's give it a test drive. After a while, you pick up a little operating technique. Notice how I back off a little bit on the return with the router. This is to keep the blade from catching on the unrouted portion and tendency to pull the router towards the other side of the sled. There's nothing clean about this process. Chips and dust all over the shop. You can see a little bit later how I captured some of the chips and dust in the process. With one side flattened, it's simply a manner of shearing off the hot glue with a putty knife, flipping the board over, and because it's flat on the other side, all I did was run a 4 to 6 inch bead of hot glue on 4 corners of the board. I'll show you another board here. This board is narrow enough to fit through the planer, but neither side is flat enough to start with. I built another set of rails for this board because I needed longer ones, and in the process I think I learned a lesson here. I'm using 3/4 inch MDF, 2.5 inches wide. This gives me nice, clean, parallel edges to work with. As far as lessons learned on cleanup, I put a big gulp at the receiving end of the flattening trough and used it directly connected to my dust collector and was able to easily collect most of the chips in the process. One final note, I'm not too sure what the result will be with a special purpose router bit, but you notice some phantom lines that are left with the bit I was using. Those are easily removed with a vibrating sander, 80 grit, and then 150 in about 10-15 minutes. That's it, folks. I hope you learned something. Thanks for watching. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you want to get an automatic alert when I post another video. In the meantime, I've got to get back and start working on the rest of this lumber. Happy woodworking!